Welcome to the module Influences on Parenting. My name is Nikki Kovan and I work at the Center for Early Education and Development at the U. Today we're going to be talking about parenting and why parents parent the way they do. We'll start off talking about first why the quality of parenting matters for young kids. And then next we'll look at what factors in the environment impact why a person parents the way they do. And then we'll talk about what other factors within a person, so things like mental health or our own history of being parented, the characteristics of the children we're being parented, how those things impact how a parent works and operates. And then we'll do a little talking about interventions and what kind of interventions are successful with parents, what are the things that need to happen within interventions for parents in order to make them effective, and how to help increase the quality of engagement of parents in the interventions. We're going to start off talking about the quality of parenting and how it impacts or what it impacts in young kids. What are the things that children do better at when they have high quality parenting? And just quickly, the types of parenting that I'm talking about when we talk about high quality parenting are things like responsive and sensitive caregiving. That basically means when your child gives you a bid for attention or is indicating some level of frustration or distress, that you respond most of the time. It doesn't have to be all of the time, no one's perfect, but most of the time you expect responsive and sensitive caregivers to pay attention to what their children's needs are and to do their best to meet those needs. So the various different domains of development that are impacted by parenting quality, it's really pretty much everything, but it ranges from social competence with peers to academic achievement, the development of morality or conscience, the development of behavior problems, and mental health of the child or child well-being. High-quality parenting can even buffer children from other environmental stressors like poverty or neighborhood violence, things like that. In fact, the quality of parenting may be even more important under circumstances in which the child is exposed to multiple other stressors. So when a child undergoes some trauma or stressor, children who have a history of receiving responsive caregiving do better managing the associated stress than children who have not experienced high-quality parenting. One specific example comes from Megan Gunner's research, and she looked at infants who were receiving immunizations. It's a pretty low-key stressor, but one that definitely elevates children's stress response. And so the way Megan measures stress response is looking at a hormone called cortisol that responds when children and adults experience some significant stressor. Their brain releases this stress hormone called cortisol, and you can measure it through saliva. So she brought them into the lab and did a laboratory procedure called the strain situation to look at the quality of the parent-child relationship using attachment classification. And then she measured their saliva shortly after receiving their vaccinations to see how much stress hormone was in their body. And what she found was that infants who had a secure attachment or a good parent-child relationship seemed to manage the mild stressor better than children who had insecure attachments to their primary caregiver. In other words, the presence of a responsive caregiver served to buffer the infant from the stressful experience of being vaccinated, and we found this in a number of other areas. High-quality parenting really can buffer infants and toddlers and young children from feeling the stress. So we just talked about the fact that parenting quality matters. What are the things that impact a parent's ability to parent? In order to think about this, people often talk about Bronfenbrenner's ecological theory. And the basic idea of Bronfenbrenner's ecological theory is that individuals live in sort of a sphere of various levels of influence. Some of them are very close and some of them are farther away, more distal factors that impact the individual. And so when you look at the picture, you'll see that the closest circles are things like our family, our school, our peers, our work, the neighborhoods we live in, religious affiliations, if any. And then the next circle are the sort of interactions between those things. So how the quality of the support system we have in our family might interact with the demands of our work environment. Basically, that some parents may have in work environments that require them to work longer hours, maybe less understanding about the need to use sick time. Whether or not you experience that as a stress may interact with whether or not you have a supportive family or a partner who has a job that's more flexible, things like that. So it's the interaction of those levels. The next level outside of that is things like our political system, the economic system, our government system, the sort of basic outer layers, the things that we think about when we vote, but not necessarily. You don't think about them on a daily basis, but they still have an impact on how we parent and our ability to parent well. And then the next level is a much more bigger sort of cultural. I think it's the cultural level you can think about, and these are our overarching beliefs and values. And even though these things are very distal, they're far away from the actual, parent-child interaction. You don't think about them when you're watching a parent and a child interact, but they can have a huge influence on parents. So for instance, cultural values and expectations have been shown to have a huge relationship in the differences in the way people parent. So depending on your cultural background and values, you may have a different disciplinary style. It can impact the amount of talking that you direct to your child and the expectations of independence or dependence that you have of children. And all of those things have a really sort of pretty direct impact on how parents interact with their children. And it turns out that these impacts can be especially strong, particularly with culture, when parents' own cultural background is in conflict with the cultural environment in which they're raising their children. And that's just one reason why we have to think when we're working with families about how those different cultural backgrounds are interacting with sort of the dominant cultural expectations of parenting. What are some of the environmental factors that put parents at risk for poor parenting? The reason they do is these factors like poverty, violence in the home, safety of the neighborhoods they're living in, their work conditions, whether or not they have a supportive boss or work policies in place that allow them to stay home with sick children, vacation time, things like that. The community support for parenting, low social support or isolation, all of those things put parents at risk for poor parenting because they overwhelm the ability of parents to focus on their children and what they're doing at home. When you're worrying about how you're going to feed your kids or how you're going to get to work that day, all of those things make it really difficult to have warm, responsive interactions with children on a regular basis. So when you think about some of these individual environments, research has shown, for instance, that parents who live in poverty tend to provide more punitive parenting. There's probably a lot of reasons for that. One of them is that when you don't have much time, you tend to be more punitive as a parent. It takes a lot of time and energy to stop, to not react quickly, to think about your response, things like that. And those are luxuries that parents who are living in poverty often don't have. The safety of neighborhoods, research has shown that parents who are worried about, who live in unsafe neighborhoods tend to be more restrictive and controlling. This has the benefit of keeping their children alive in a lot of cases, but it does also have unintended consequences, potentially of dampening the child's sense of autonomy and agency. Another example, when you look at community support for parenting, research has shown that the positive associations between authoritative parenting, that's parenting where you provide high-quality structure, rules, consequences that are developmentally appropriate, that the association between that style of parenting and good outcomes for kids are strongest when kids are in a peer group with other children whose parents also have that same parenting style. So we should make sure to appreciate the value of what it's like to try and parent in a community of parents who are different from you and how that may be easier to parent the same way that your peers are parenting their children. And that those are all factors we need to consider when we're working with parents. So some researchers have criticized Bronfenbrenner's ecological model. And the reason for that is because you look back on Bronfenbrenner's model, and it has the individual in the center. He didn't get around to talking about ontogenetic development. And that's essentially a fancy way of talking about the development of the individual. In other words, the individual characteristics that make up who a person is, their genetic makeup, their experiences, things like that. All of those things are also brought to the table when you're thinking about why an individual is the way they are. And so we're going to sort of apply that model to why a parent is the way a parent is. And so we think about things like education or access to education, the mental health of the parent, the history that that parent experienced in their own home of being parented. That has a huge impact on how they parent their children. And the characteristics of the children that they're taking care of also impact the kind of parent that an individual is. So we're going to first talk about mental health and how that impacts parenting. Maternal depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and personality disorder traits are all related to lower quality parenting. Specifically, more negativity, more laxness, and lack of warmth by parents. Many studies have also demonstrated long-term impacts of maternal depression and other parental psychopathology on children's outcomes. So not only does mental health of the parent impact how they parent, it also has a long-term impact on children. And it turns out that it looks like the timing of the psychopathology or the mental health problems for parents matters too. So children who have mothers who are depressed during their infancy might show a specific developmentally atypical pattern compared to children who had mothers who were depressed during their preschool period. We also think that maternal depression is especially negative in the first few years of life when infants and toddlers are so reliant on that caregiver for their emotional well-being. So we talked about mental health of parents and how that impacts the quality of parenting they're able to provide. Now we're going to talk a little bit about how the history of how you were parented yourself. So your experience of being parented as a young child and how that's carried forward and impacts how you parent your own child. So there are several longitudinal studies that began when participants were young children and are now following these participants into adulthood and parenthood. Many of these studies have identified significant relations in parenting quality across generations. In other words, how we were parented does seem to relate to how we parent our children. I'm going to talk about one study in particular that I worked on as a graduate student here at the university, and that's the Minnesota longitudinal study of parents and children. And this study began in the late 70s in the Twin Cities metro area, following identified an at-risk sample of mothers who were giving birth in public hospitals, didn't have health insurance. And it was about 200 parents, 200 mothers in their third trimester, and we began following them then and as they gave birth, and continued following them and their children and then eventually just their children once they became adults. Target participants are now around 36, and we did assessments with the moms before they gave birth, shortly after birth, at 7 and 10 days, at 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, 24 months, 36 months, 42 months, 48 months, 54 months. And then in kindergarten, we started doing assessments with teachers and parents, as well as the children. Did that again in first and second grade, possibly third grade, I believe, in sixth grade, and then we brought them in for a lab assessment when they were 13 with their parents and did interactions between them and their parents looking at parenting quality again. We did assessments with teachers again at 16 and 17 and a half, as well as parents and children. And then at age 19, we began bringing participants in without their parent as they became adults. We did that at 21, 23, 26, 28, 32, and they're now bringing them in again for another assessment. And we looked at the development of mental illness or psychopathology. We looked at competence in domains like work and romantic relationships as they became adults. And in addition, many of them started becoming parents. In fact, that started happening when they were 13. I think the first participant gave birth. And they're continuing to have kids, and we bring them in with them, with their own kids, when their kids are 12 months, 24 months, and 42 months. And those are the same, we do the same interactions that we did with them and their mother when they were those ages. Essentially, what we found when we looked at the data, we coded the interactions between them and their mothers, 30 years ago, and we then coded them again with them and their own children. And looked at parenting quality, and what we have found that the quality of parenting that they received at that same age period, so either at 12 months or 24 months or 42 months, accounts for almost a third of the variation in how they parented their own children, on average 24 years later. This is a pretty amazing finding, and we controlled for sort of the other sort of influences that we thought might be in play, so we looked at whether or not parents were living in poverty, and whether or not, as children, and whether or not they were in poverty as they were parenting their own kids. We controlled for that. We controlled for IQ, and we also controlled for how they were parented by their parents at age 13. So it turns out how they were parented at 24 months was a much stronger predictor of how they parented their own toddler than how they were parented as a 13-year-old. So it's not simply that children are remembering, or these participants were remembering how they were parented and were carrying that forward. It seems to be something more than that. There's something about the quality of the interactions that they are internalizing and carrying forward and then come out, probably not even consciously all the time, when they're interacting with their own kids. Just so you have a chance to kind of see the kinds of interactions that the study used in order to look at parent-child quality, I'm going to show you a video clip here. And as you're watching the video clip, I want you to pay attention to what the mom's doing and what the child's doing, and what are the kinds of interactions that you see happening, and what you think might be important to pay attention to when you're thinking about how those interactions might be carried forward by that child as she grows up and becomes a mother herself, and what might be carried forward into the interactions that she has with her own child.
At age 2, we see clear signs of emerging independence. She works hard on these challenging problems on her own. She attacks the problems eagerly and with enthusiasm. But there are times when she needs help, and she is quite effective in seeking out her mother at those times. This lever problem is even harder, and she again seeks help. Here is a clever solution to the lever problem.
You do. Can't you do it? What do you want? Let him go. What do you want me to do?
Push up, just keep going.
Show Mama. Show me how.
Just gonna put on this guy. I could be cat.
Again, we see notable persistence. We are beginning to see the active coping and problem solving we'll see more clearly at later ages. She is flexible enough, moreover, to follow her mother's directives to another solution. And she experiences an obvious pleasure in her successful efforts.
So you've watched the video and thought about what kinds of interactions you think might be carried forward. A lot of people in the research world think that it's the actual specific behaviors that are learned and that it's those specific behaviors that we carry forward. But some preliminary data that we haven't published yet shows that it's not actually the specific behavior. So it's not whether or not you smile at your kid or necessarily exactly how much you talk to your kid, but the way you talk to your child, the way you're interacting with your child, the kind of support and help you're providing, that is carried forward into the next generation. So the specific behaviors from one generation to the next generation weren't related, but the overall sort of global quality of the interaction between the parent and the child did relate to the overall global quality and interactions that they provided for their own child. So the flip side of this, we're talking mostly at this point about how your history of parenting is carried forward, and we are talking mostly about sort of positive qualities of parenting. The flip side is, of course, the intergenerational continuity of abuse and neglect. So parents with a history of being maltreated and neglected by an adult when they were a child are much more likely to neglect or abuse their own children. And the estimates are anywhere between 20 and 40%. Prospective studies have looked 20 to 40% of children who are abused and neglected grow up to have children and abuse and neglect their own children. And it's a really high number, but I think notably it's not nearly all, it's not even half. So it's not deterministic. It's not true that just because you were abused, you will necessarily grow up to abuse your own child. But most importantly in that are what are the factors then that relate to whether or not you're able to break that cycle of abuse. And it's things, not surprisingly I think, that you might expect. So having another positive adult role model in your life, whether that's a teacher or another parent, a grandparent, someone who treats you with sensitivity and respect and kindness can play a significant role in helping you break the cycle of abuse. Getting individual therapy to come to terms with your own experience of it as a child is related to your ability to break the cycle. And the support of a healthy partner in parenting is also significantly related to a parent's ability to break the cycle of abuse. So we've talked about our own history of being parented and the mental health of the parent as being factors that relate to how we parent or how a parent parents their own child. Another quality is the characteristics of the individual children that they're parenting. So if any of you are parents of more than one child, I'm sure you know what it's like to try and parent two children who are quite different. I imagine you've noticed that you don't do exactly the same things with those children. And that's because children are active agents in their own environment, including parents. They're not just passive recipients of what happens. They interact with and elicit reactions and behaviors from other people in their environment, and these things have a back and forth interplay. These interactions are reciprocal. Parenting impacts the child's behavior just as the child's characteristics elicit certain kinds of parenting, and so you can kind of think of these as kind of a ball that you get rolling. And so what are some of these characteristics that children bring to the table that impact the parenting they receive? One is their current developmental stage or the period of development that they're in. So infants elicit very different caregiving behaviors than do toddlers, than do preschoolers, than do adolescents. Temperament is another characteristic that children bring to the table. So some children, infants, are incredibly fussy and difficult to soothe. Other infants are very easygoing and laid back, and those temperament styles elicit different kinds of parenting behaviors as well. So a parenting style that's beneficial for one kind of child might not be beneficial or may not be important for another kind of child. A specific example of this is found in Grażyna Kochanska's work. Kochanska found that for children with fearful temperaments, using a gentle disciplinary style was more effective than using a power-assertive disciplinary style. But it turned out that for children with an exuberant temperament, ones who kind of were gung-ho and just jump into things and aren't cautious, that the type of parenting really wasn't important. It wasn't that using a power-assertive disciplinary style was good, it just didn't seem to matter much. They had such a strong presence, it was not important. But it did turn out that being a responsive parent with a good quality relationship for those exuberant children was extremely important. So in the absence of that responsive, strong, positive relationship, those children, those exuberant children, suffered. Another example of these sort of reciprocal interactions that occur between children and parents are that children with temperaments that put them at risk for the development of antisocial behavior. There was a study that was done looking at children who were adopted. And so these children were adopted into families, and it turned out that they elicited harsh parenting from their adoptive parents during early childhood. And in fact, that parenting that they received, that parenting style, put them at even greater risk for the development of antisocial behavior in adolescence. So it was this idea that this temperament of the child, which wasn't necessarily the temperament of the parents, since they were genetically unrelated, actually elicited harsh parenting that the parents didn't necessarily provide to children who didn't have this difficult temperament style. And that this parenting style was actually even a stronger predictor of the development of antisocial behavior than the difficult temperament was just all by itself. One more example, also coming from Grażyna Kochanska's work, looked at gene and environment interaction. Children who had a short, it's called a 5-HTT-LPR allele. Anyway, when they had one short allele, two alleles make up a sort of gene. So when they had one short allele and one long allele, those children who had parents who were more responsive were significantly more competent than mothers who were less responsive. But for kids who had two long alleles that made up that particular gene, responsiveness had no effect at all. It didn't matter. So in that case, our genetic makeup puts us at risk for sort of negative outcomes only in the presence of low-quality parenting. But parenting by itself wasn't enough either. So for kids who had two long alleles, it didn't matter whether or not for this particular aspect of development that they were looking at, that the researchers were looking at. It didn't matter if they had a highly responsive parent or a sort of more lower responsive parent. They looked fine regardless. So we've talked about all of these things that impact the quality of parenting. Mental health, our own history of being parented, characteristics of kids. It turns out that there's a bidirectional nature of influence here. These characteristics that influence a person's development as a parent also interact with the systems within the ecological model that Bronfenbrenner talked about. So parents with a history of depression may be especially vulnerable to the effects of poverty. Parents with a history of being treated responsively and sensitively as a young child by their own parent may be able to fall back on those resources in the face of other environmental stressors like domestic violence or poor social support. Another example is that a parent with low economic and social resources may respond harshly to a child with difficult temperament, but that very same parent with better resources may have the energy necessary to respond sensitively to that child with a difficult temperament. The basic idea here is that these things are very complicated and all of the levels are very interrelated. It's not that we can say that parenting is the most important thing under all circumstances. It is incredibly important. So are the characteristics of the environment, including safe neighborhoods, safe homes. All of those things all matter and interact in some really complex ways that can be difficult to pull apart, but we know that they are all important. Which leads us to interventions with parents and children. So knowing that the context in which a parent is parenting, including their own developmental history, their mental health, the cultural and social context in which they're parenting, that all of those things are extremely important. And they're even more important when we're thinking about the best ways to intervene. We have to understand those things about a parent and a child in order to intervene successfully. So next I'm going to talk about a couple of different intervention strategies. I'm just going to describe them, some of the evidence of why they work, and some specific examples of models that seem to work well. And then we'll come back and talk about why they seem to work for some families and not others, why certain models work, why others don't. So the first model we're going to talk about is home visiting. Home visiting is an intervention strategy that has a pretty long history of research, and this long history of research is really mixed. So sometimes it seems to work and sometimes it doesn't. I'm not going to go over home visiting too much. It tends to be a comprehensive model of serving families. One of the biggest variations that's often talked about is about who conducts the home visit. So some models use trained paraprofessionals, other models use highly educated trained nurses, parent educators, early childhood educators. Some models conduct home visits for years, while others last 12 weeks. Some provide weekly home visits, other monthlies. There's just a lot of variation in what home visiting looks like. So all of these differences in the various models make it really difficult to make conclusions about home visiting broadly. However, I want to just focus for the purpose of this model on what in general home visiting programs do very well, and that's addressing the broad context in which parents are living. They provide direct needs assessments, they do referrals for parents who have mental health problems, they help parents find social support systems, and they bring the intervention to the home environment, reducing the need for families to have to transport themselves, which is often a huge barrier for families living in poverty. A couple examples of home visiting strategies that have demonstrated impact on maltreatment or behaviors related to maltreatment are the Nurse-Family Partnership, Healthy Families America, and then another intervention called Family Checkup. Family Checkup is one of the newer home visiting intervention models, and I think what's really interesting about it and what I want to highlight about it is that they do what they call motivational interviewing with the family. It's a 3-visit intervention. It's very brief, with the ability to do referral and follow up with families. The first visit with the family includes what they call a motivational interview, where they really talk to the parent and try and get at what it is that the parent wants and needs for their family, and identify the goals that they have, and then they help them talk about how to achieve those goals. The second visit is a videotape of the interaction, and in the third, between the parent and the child, with the sort of goals that the parents already created in mind. And the third visit is a video feedback, where they talk to the parent about what they seem to be doing well, what they could work on based on the goals that they already established. If needed, they refer these families to further intervention. But they, from this brief intervention model, are having pretty good outcomes even 2 or 3 years later. So they first started off by targeting children who are at risk for having conduct problems, and showed that by age 5, by kindergarten entry, these kids were far less likely than their peers who didn't receive the intervention to be identified by teachers and parents as having behavior problems. So they've had a lot of success with a pretty brief intervention, and I think one of the critical key aspects that I just wanted to highlight, we'll come back to in a little bit, is that they really work hard to get at what the parents need, what the parents see as their goals and wants for their family, and to work around those in order to get high buy-in on the part of the family. One other intervention mode is group-based parent education or parent training. This type of intervention is usually more brief than home visiting, though not always, as we just talked about, the sort of 3 visits. With the family checkup model, it serves more families at once. When it's well done, it can build relationships and support systems between members of the group. It also provides similar content to home visiting. It often, so it focuses on child development and parenting practices, disciplinary strategies. Some examples of effective programs are Incredible Years, which has been modified to be done with parents who have open child protection cases. And attachment and biobehavioral catch-up intervention is another group-based parent education model, which was designed specifically for children in foster care. They first did it with foster care parents, and they're now adapting it to do with bio parents who are in the child protection system. If you want to read a little bit more about each of these models, there are links to articles that are just 2 pages that you can take a look at that describe the intervention and some of their effectiveness. So why do some interventions work sometimes and not others? If you take a look back at the influences on parenting, I think you get a sense of what might be factors that relate to the effectiveness. So things like interventions that don't address the relationship needs of the parent, that don't address the mental health needs of the parent, and that don't get through the environmental barriers or the context in which a parent is parenting that allow them to either access or not access the intervention, are all factors of interventions that relate to their effectiveness. Not surprisingly. These factors that we talked about essentially cause the intervention to be ineffective because the parent fails to engage in the intervention. And when you're not engaged in the model and learning whatever you're doing, they generally don't learn. There's no outcomes associated with those types of learning environments. So how can we improve a parent's engagement and therefore their outcomes in the intervention? One way that's critical and that we need to think about all the time, especially when working with families at risk, is overcoming barriers to access. So that's things like providing transportation, providing food during meetings, providing childcare, reducing scheduling conflicts, so thinking about when are the best times and days to offer parent education groups or to do home visits, and potentially providing some incentive for families to get there, and if needed, going into the home to meet the family where they're at. Some other factors that researchers have identified that appear to be related to the parents' engagement in the intervention is whether or not the intervention has made cultural adaptations as needed. So when we adapt interventions to meet the cultural needs or to be culturally sensitive to the population being served, families tend to be more engaged in the intervention. When we focus on relationship quality between the intervener and the parent, interventions also tend to be more effective. Interventions that provide or refer parents for mental health services as needed, getting them the help they need when you are depressed or anxious or have some sort of illness. It's very difficult to actually benefit from parenting intervention. So once we help them find the help they need to get in order to be healthy mentally, they can engage in the parenting intervention. Finally, coming back to what we talked about with what Family Checkup does really well, is they meet parents where they're at. They take the time to find out what parents want, what they need, and then actually tailor the intervention strategy to them. So they refer parents based on what the parent says they need. And this isn't to say that the intervener doesn't provide feedback, doesn't help them come up with these goals, doesn't use their expert opinion to sort of guide the direction that parents are going. But ultimately, parents are more engaged, are more able to benefit from intervention if they feel like someone's listening to them. So that concludes our module on the influences on parenting. I think the real take-home messages here are that parenting quality does absolutely matter. There are lots of factors, however, that both interact with and influence parenting. So it's not just that the environmental context matters, it's not just that mental health matters because it influences parents directly. In fact, from the perspective of a children, those things have a direct impact on the quality of parenting they're receiving But there's also that interplay that we talked about, whereas, parenting might actually be more important under circumstances of high stress than it is for children growing up in environments and circumstances with very low stress. So there's those bidirectional influences. It's not a simple, direct relationship between any of these factors. And it's complicated, and therefore helping parents become better parents is also complicated. And we really need to pay attention to all of the various factors that parents are struggling with in order to help them be the best parent that they can be for the particular child that they're parenting.